I give the call to the member for Gippsland.
Well, thank you, Deputy Speaker. I do take great pleasure in joining the debate on the wage justice for early childhood education and care workers, and in doing so, Deputy Speaker, I would note this is one of those occasions where there is a high degree of agreement across the chamber in relation to the importance of the issues we're addressing in this bill. But also want to recognise, Deputy Speaker, that I think every member of this place would have a shared passion for ensuring that young Australians, all young Australians, have an opportunity to achieve their full potential, and that investing in our families, supporting families and allowing them to support their children in fulfilling their dreams and aspirations is in fact a core business for the Federal Parliament of Australia. And I'll make a couple of general observations, Deputy Speaker. In my role as Shadow Minister for Education and also as a local MP now for 16 years, I've had a great deal of consultation with people around Australia and across Gippsland in relation to the issues surrounding early childhood education and care. And it struck me over that period of time, Deputy Speaker, that it is quite ironic that we like to almost deceive ourselves as Australians in that we say the people we care about the most are our young people, or we really care about our old people and ageing and elderly, and we really care about people with disabilities. But the people who are employed to care for those older Australians, younger Australians and people with disabilities are often the most poorly paid people in our nation. And it is a deception on ourselves, Deputy Speaker, and that's why I do welcome many aspects of the bill before the House, because it does seek to address some of the inequities in what is a predominantly female-dominated industry, which has been undervalued and underappreciated in the past. So I do congratulate the government in that regard. Some of the worst paid Australians are those who are involved in the care economy. And we do need, though, Deputy Speaker, a very strong economy to ensure that taxpayers are in a position to provide the additional support that's required to fulfil our honourable and very desirable aims in this regard. So as a matter of basic principle, Deputy Speaker, I do understand and welcome the efforts to attract and retain a workforce in the childcare and early education sector. Those early days in a child's life are critical to their future outcomes, and whether it be through a formalised care environment, through long day care or through family day care or other models, having the opportunity, particularly for vulnerable children, to have them in an environment where they can be assessed for any learning or developmental delays, and then getting access to appropriate allied health care, whether it be speech pathology or whatever it might be, is critical to those long-term outcomes I spoke about at the outset of helping every young Australian achieve their full potential. I am worried, though, Deputy Speaker, that as much as those opposite have moved in a manner to address some of the pay issues for our childcare and early educators, they seem to have missed the point in relation to the families who live in rural, regional and remote locations. And we're still facing, Deputy Speaker, an enormous problem with childcare deserts in many of the electorates that the people on this side of the House represent, particularly in the National Party. Sadly, Deputy Speaker, where we live, in many of our communities, there are no long day care centres available, and whether or not you pay a childcare educator more doesn't really matter if there's no centre for the children to attend to in the first place. So just increasing the childcare wages for the workers, or even increasing the Commonwealth childcare subsidies, actually doesn't address the fundamental issues for those people in those communities that we represent. So I would encourage the government, encourage the minister and encourage people on this side of the House as well to keep working in a constructive manner together as much as possible to address the issue of childcare deserts, so that all young Australians, whether they live in a rural and remote location or a suburban or in an urban area, have that opportunity to achieve their full potential and have that opportunity in their earliest years to have access to childcare and early education. So, Deputy Speaker, I would note that the Coalition, and I think every member of this place, obviously the government and those on the crossbench as well, would recognise that our early childhood teachers and educators work extremely hard, and we won't be standing in the way of a wage rise for those people, but we still have some concerns about this bill and the policy going forward. There's no question that the government's policies in the last 2.5 years have contributed to the cost of living crisis, which has made it harder and even more necessary for Australian families to have additional working hours and then draw on the need for childcare in the first place. So we believe, as those opposite believe, that our early childhood educators do an incredible job caring for and educating our youngest Australians. But the reality is that this policy is appearing now as something more of a pre-election sweetener and an effort to appease voters on the eve of an election period. Just as we saw on the weekend a very expensive announcement by the Prime Minister trying to buy some friends amongst the university set, we now have this policy which appears to be very focused on ensuring that a unionised workforce has access to higher wages in the lead-up to election period. And what concerns us is there is not enough focus on the real challenge in our rural and regional and remote communities. This is an issue that the government has been urged to address throughout this term in office and has failed to do so. And appearing at the committee inquiry into this legislation, Mrs Louise Martin from the Isolated Children and Parents Association stated that it would do nothing for the families that organisation supports. When asked by Senator O'Sullivan, do you believe this bill will make much of a difference to the families you represent without a measure similar to what we're discussing here, Mrs Martin said, I would say about 0% really. Mrs Martin also noted the Albanese government wasn't doing much to increase access in the regions. And again, when asked by Senator O'Sullivan, are you aware of anything that the current government is doing alongside this bill that might address the lack of access in these childcare deserts, specifically in the areas that you operate across regional and rural Australia? Sadly, Mrs Martin's response was, not specifically. Occasionally there's money for mobile daycare. Grant funding yet again is uncertain. Really, I don't see anything of significance that this government is doing to address this issue out here. Now, Deputy Speaker, I raise those points because, looking to the future, we do need to be investing in our early educators and childcare, and we also need to be investing in our families, an important role that parents play in ensuring that young people have the best possible start in life. Looking to the future, if we think we're going to keep on doing the same thing and getting a different outcome in our rural and regional communities, we are sadly mistaken. We need more focus when it comes to early education and childcare on choice, on access and on flexible models that can work in our regional communities. And when I say choice, Deputy Speaker, I could quite deliberately make the point that this is about respecting the choice that different families will make with their children's upbringing. We do need to make it possible for more families to care for their own child in the first place, if that is their choice and it's possible in their circumstance. And there's no judgment intended here or no judgment given by anyone in relation to that choice. I respect the choice of families who need to access full-time daycare, just as much as I respect the choice of families who have made the decision to look after their own children as much as they possibly can. But I'm disappointed, Deputy Speaker, that throughout the past probably 20 years, there has been more of a focus away from providing that choice for those families who would prefer to spend more time where possible, that most precious of all commodities, spend more time where possible raising their own children rather than feeling obliged or forced or pressured in some way to have to access a childcare centre. So I think choice is an important issue in this debate going forward. The question around access, Deputy Speaker, is one that I've touched on already, and it's one that every rural and regional member will be well aware of. In the childcare deserts that many of us represent, there is simply no opportunity to access a formalised care model which is subsidised by the Australian taxpayers. So if we are going to be in a position in our regional communities to attract and retain a workforce, and that might be a workforce in teaching, in nursing, paramedics, police, you name it. It is very difficult to attract and retain a skilled workforce in a regional community if you can't offer childcare to the families seeking to relocate to those communities. Childcare in that regard and early education is an enabling service for those families to be able to provide their other essential services to the broader economy and the broader community. It does let people get back to work if that is their choice, and improving access to childcare right across rural and regional Australia has to be a fundamental aim. And it's become more challenging, I think, Deputy Speaker, in the last few years as cost of living pressures have really started to bite. There is no question that the vast majority of families would not be able to pay their mortgage, cover the household bills, face all those increasing costs without having access to more than one income. Maybe not two full-time incomes, maybe one and a half, maybe one and some casual work, but they certainly need more than one regular household income to meet those bills in a lot of our communities. And having that access to childcare services in more communities is critical for us if we're going to be able to attract the workforce, retain the workforce, and allow our families to deal with the cost of living pressures in rural and regional areas. And the other point I wanted to make, Deputy Speaker, in relation to looking to the future, when I mentioned choice, I mentioned access, and I mentioned flexibility. Flexibility means the bureaucrats in Canberra need to start listening to those smaller communities where the model of a corporate care, a large daycare centre, simply doesn't work. There are not going to be the need, there's not the demand for 100 children places in many of our towns, but there is a need still. There is a need for the local nurse or police officer or paramedic to have access to care. We need to find some more flexible models that support those smaller communities. And that may well be investing more in family daycare and supporting some of the infrastructure required for that. It may well be going to local councils and saying, do you have a public building that you could actively repurpose for a smaller daycare, childcare environment and early education environment, and we may have to assist them with their infrastructure needs. The corporate model will not work in many of our communities, and simply saying we're going to keep increasing the Commonwealth childcare subsidy or increasing the wages for existing childcare and early educated workers will not overcome that challenge of access and flexibility in our rural and remote communities. So, Deputy Speaker, I'll finish where I started on a very bipartisan note. I genuinely believe that across this chamber there is an enormous amount of goodwill when it comes to early childhood education and care workers, and ensuring that every young person in this great nation has the opportunity to achieve their full potential. And I do urge those opposite to continue to engage constructively with this side of the House, because many of us have a background in more rural, remote and regional locations, and believe we can assist in coming up with local solutions to what are very much local problems, and working with the Minister to ensure that every child in Australia has the opportunity to achieve their full potential. I thank the House.